Welcome to News in Depth, where we delve deeper into the biggest stories of the day, and I'm Kim Mo-kyun. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who's on his week-long overseas trip, attended the 77th UN General Assembly Tuesday, and there he delivered his first address, mainly centered on joint efforts to protect the values of freedom to overcome economic and security crisis. Now, on the sidelines of his visit, he's set to hold summits with his American and Japanese counterparts too, with a range of issues on the table. To help us analyze the diplomatic developments over the president's activities in New York, we have Dr. Go Myung-hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies here in the studio with us. Dr. Go, welcome.
It's good to be here.
So, anticipation was very high for President Yoon Suk-yeol's attendance at the UN General Assembly because it's a very rare opportunity for world leaders to gather in one place. I must ask, given that it was his first address there, how did you find his latest diplomatic efforts?
So I think it was quite a positive outcome. There's a clearly very concise message that he prepared for the assembly, addressing the assembly this time, and I really like his speech because it's very well structured in the sense that he tied together the values and norms, and in this case he emphasized freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, and freedom from poverty. And he tied that concept to the idea of Korea standing up as a more of a responsible player and lend assistance to countries that are in need of those freedoms and also assistances. And so in that sense, I think this speech was really about South Korea being a more of a responsible actor in the international stage. And instead of being Korea a source of bad news or tension and conflict with North Korea, he tried to convey this message that South Korea is essentially a constructive player now and is contributing positively to the global good, and which is something that the United Nations is very much interested in terms of development for resource-poor countries. So, I mean, he didn't really outline specific programs, but but he alluded major contribution to be made in terms of combating COVID-19, as well as fostering more green growth and green overseas development assistance. So I think it's been quite a well-crafted message, and we'll see how that's received in the international community. But I'm sure that the international community probably found this to be very positive.
Now, staying with President Yoon's speech at the General Assembly, another thing to note was that usually during the speeches, there was a message about North Korea from the South Korean leaders, but President Yoon didn't directly mention North Korea during his speech. And some say this is because the Yoon's policy on North Korea didn't change from when he announced the audacious initiative. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think President Yoon outlined the thoughts behind why he didn't mention North Korea in his UN address, and then he obliquely criticized his predecessor, President Moon Jae-in, for being too focused or even obsessed about North Korea. So he probably thought that the stage this time of the United Nations General Assembly wasn't a stage for South Korea or for his administration to outline his approach towards the North, which been publicized already under the name of the audacious plan or bold plan. So he probably believes that that's a separate track, meaning the United Nations General Assembly address is a separate track from any policy statement regarding North Korea. So it's really about South Korea getting out of this shadow cast by North Korea, and then essentially making a proclamation that it's no longer a regional player, it's a global player. And then when you come to the global stage, there are other agendas, there are other priorities. These are the priorities that he mentioned in his speech, such as development and assistance to poorer countries than us. So I think this is his overall global vision for Korea. And so North Korea is going to figure very highly, but then always, any South Korean president, North Korea will be a high priority issue. But President Yoon probably believed that this wasn't the occasion or the stage for that.
Now, moving on to other countries, amid the Cold War-like confrontation between the U.S. and China, Russia and China seem to have shown some alliance lately against Washington. And in the midst of this, China and Russian leaders haven't attended the UN General Assembly. How do you forecast the relations and the tensions on that issue to unfold?
So it's going to be worsening before it gets better. So I think the prospect of improvement or worsening of the relationship among the great powers will rest upon the outcome of the ongoing war in Ukraine. It seems like Russia is on the defensive now. Ukraine has the initiative and is well set to recover much of its lost territory. So I think that means an intensification of the conflict, and we know that the Russians are, given that it's a nuclear state, they are willing to escalate the warfare beyond what the international community can tolerate at the moment. And so this is something that is very worrisome. And until that situation is resolved, it will be difficult to prognosticate how the ongoing tension between the great powers will unfold. So overall, I think we'll have to expect more tension, more conflict, and even major escalation in the warfare, not just in Ukraine, but I think the conflict in Ukraine, because it involves Russia and there's NATO backing up Ukraine at the moment, could easily spread to other parts of the world. It's something that we have to watch out for.
Right. And going back to New York, President Yoon Suk-yeol and his American counterpart are set to hold a summit in the next few hours from now. And a lot is on the table, but first regarding the Korean won weakening against the US dollar, there have been voices calling for South Korea to clinch a currency swap deal exclusively with the US. How do you see such possibilities?
So I think it's not, I don't think the United States or even the South Korean government shares that perception of risk or danger that some parts of the financial community or the media have about Korea's financial situation. I think for both the United States and South Korea, in terms of governments, they view the current situation as a temporary appreciation of the dollar value vis-a-vis not just the Korean won, but against all other currencies pretty much, except for, interesting enough, the Chinese yuan and then Russian ruble. So it's probably the United States thinks that this not, the current weak Korean won doesn't represent the economic fundamentals of the South Korean economy right now. It's, even though it's suffering from some trade deficits, but the fundamentals are very strong. We have a very competitive firms, and then the overall the economy is competitive. So probably the United States thinks that extending the swap it could actually exacerbate the view or the fear in the financial community that something is afoot, that maybe the Korea is even riskier than the market believes it is. So it's better to stick to the neutral ground and then stick to the policy of patience and moderation.
Right.
That wouldn't preclude having a swap agreement between the United States and South Korea, but it's likely that the United States doesn't believe it's time yet.
So they're having a more cautious approach right now. Now, on the Inflation Reduction Act, this is a very big agenda on the table between South Korea and Washington. This has caused strong backlash from many parts of South Korean communities because it will directly affect local car makers. So, but considering President Biden has already signed the act, is there a chance for South Korea or the U.S. to do something to help South Korean companies at this point?
It will be difficult for the United States government to amend an legislative act that was passed by the U.S. Congress after the fact. So, it means that somebody at the White House or the U.S. Congress will have to reinitiate the amendment process. And we have to remember that the Inflation Reduction Act was treated as a major victory achievement for the Biden administration. So it will be difficult for the Biden administration to go back to the drawing board and amend so-called successful legislation, just because the allies, even the allies asked the United States to change it. And then also this act was very much a political move on the part of the Biden administration. to create a favorable ground for the upcoming midterm elections in November. So that precludes the possibility of major changes happening before the midterm. And even after the midterm, it's likely that the United States might not change the act itself, but they might try to compensate the allies with some other concessions. So overall, this is, you can say this has been a success for the Biden administration domestically, but on the foreign policy front, it was a major mistake because it has upset not just South Korea, but other important U.S. allies such as Japan and the European Union. So I think this probably undermined the trust and credibility of the Biden administration in the eyes of the allies. So what's good is that I think the Biden administration is aware of this, and so they'll probably take action. But then it might not address directly the complaints that the allies have about the Inflation Reduction Act. And so in that sense, I think this is already water under the bridge, in my view.
Right, but we'll still have to see what kind of action the Biden administration would take now. Now, going back to North Korea, Sung Kim, the U.S. Special Representative for North Korean Policy, mentioned possibilities for North Korea to hold its 7th nuclear test by November. And that China would play a role on its nuclear test. What's behind this kind of logic?
So the idea is that, so it looks like the North Koreans have held back from carrying out the nuclear test because they are concerned about the potential negative Chinese reaction since President Xi Jinping of China will have his third term ratified in the upcoming Party Congress in October. So that probably explained South Korea's good behavior so far. But obviously after November, all bets are off. So, but at the same time, what's interesting is it's unclear what prompted this, but the Chinese behavior has improved markedly in the last couple of weeks. There's been a major summit in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then Kazakhstan, and then in that summit, so the Chinese leader was seen as chastising the Russian President Putin for continuing the war in Ukraine, and so it signaled to the rest of the world that the China was essentially trying to be a constructive player rather than being a spoiler for the international stability. So I think that there's a sliver of hope right now that China might also act as a constructive player, an agent of stability in this region, in the Northeast Asia as well. So it might try to pressure or convince the North Koreans from carrying out another nuclear test. And also probably the Chinese are concerned that if there's another round of sanctions following the nuclear test, that those sanctions are not going to target North Koreans, but they're going to target the facilitators for North Korean trade and illicit economic activities outside of the country, mainly based in China, Russia. So if that's indeed the case, if the United States is going to target Chinese concerns for sanctions caused by the North Korean behavior, then I think that the Chinese will be very much on the defensive and feel victimized. So this acts as a pressure point for the Chinese, in my view.
Right. Now, also in the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, there's also speculation that President Yoon Suk-yeol might hold a summit with his Japanese counterpart. But up until now, no details have been revealed yet specifically. Why do you think they're so hesitant to give any details? And if the summit happens, what kind of agenda would they discuss?
So, the summit itself would have been a major positive development optics-wise. This is the first summit that the respective leaders of Korea and Japan have held in a long time. And I think there's a high expectation on the part of Korea that the side meeting for the occasion of the United Nations Assembly would create this casual environment with low expectations, and then which makes much easier for meeting to be realized between Korea and Japan. But then we're still waiting whether that's going to be the case. But I think if the summit doesn't take place, it's likely not because of Korean behavior, it's because of Japanese political constraints. The Prime Minister Kishida of Japan is under significant political pressure because is having a meeting with the South Korean president, even though President Yoon has been very focused on improving relationship with Japan. At least in the Japanese conservative point of view, having a meeting with a Korean president could be portrayed as a concession, an unconditional concession given to the Koreans. So I think this probably is preventing Prime Minister Kishida from holding that particular summit with the South Korean president. So and then I think the agenda-wise would have been quite short because it's a side meeting. So I think most of the meaning or the value having the summit this time would have been about the optics of signaling for good that Korea and Japan are on track to improve their relationship.
All right. So let's hope that could happen in the near future. Dr. Go, as always, thank you so much for making time for us. We appreciate
It's my pleasure.
And that's all for News In-Depth tonight. Have a great rest of the evening, and we'll be back next time with more in-depth stories on issues happening across the globe now.